As you can see, we're talking about Japanese architecture today, and we're faced with the coexistence of different traditions in Japan. So let me begin by talking about prehistoric Japan. Scholars stress a complete difference, a very marked difference, between prehistoric Japan and Japan after Chinese influence began to be felt in the 6th century AD. In fact, we have a very dim understanding of Japan in prehistoric times. Prehistoric because writing, as far as we can work out, only became really a way of recording history after the Chinese influence became strong. But we can interpret the early period architecturally as having two building traditions. The first was the tradition of pit dwellings, that is, of vertical caves, which were natural caves, naturally dug into soft ground, horizontal ground, and then covered with a roof. They were often quite shallow depressions, and the extra headroom came from the pitched roof over the top. But then there is another building tradition which is represented from very early times, and that is a building on stilts. And we know that the two began to interact with each other and affect each other. We have a number of early representations on bronze vessels, dishes, bowls, gongs, bells, mirrors, and we are immediately confronted with the possibility of Dongsong culture influence. The knowledge of the Dongsong culture being present in Japan, of course, doesn't exist. We don't have any real way of emphasizing or establishing that it is there, except for the presence of the bronze. Bronze casting was copied by the Japanese quite early on, but since bronze casting was at its zenith at that period in the north of Vietnam along the Red River in the Dongsong culture, it seems quite likely that the Japanese were aware of it because of the Dongsong people trading up to Japan. And we have other bits of evidence, as you will see, for the influence of Dongsong culture in early prehistoric Japan. The bottom left of the four diagrams is a pit dwelling covered with a roof. The others are on stilts in various ways, approached up a notched log or even a kind of a built-up step system. They all have in common some sort of emphasis of the ridge piece, of the upper part of the roof, and particularly the emphasis of the eaves by tilting the eaves out, and then emphasizing it again with what appeared to be a pair of bull's horns, or symbolic representations of bull's horns at the ends of the eaves. You'll remember having seen all this before when we looked at the architecture of Indonesia, and it is not surprising to know that anthropologists believe that quite a large percentage of Japanese population emigrated in from Indonesia. But the handling of the ridge piece does seem to represent an expression of the Dongsong roof. We can see that in another bronze bas-relief, and here we can see more clearly the ladder leading up to the platform, and then that the overhanging eaves are supported by freestanding poles at the ends. So one is beginning to see something quite close to the buildings we saw in Indonesia. When we go to the earliest surviving sacred sites in Japan, the buildings are not the original buildings because the Japanese had a tradition of reconstructing the buildings every 25 years on these sites. So they have been reconstructed about 70 times in the course of history. But we assume that they have not changed them very much, maybe made them slightly more sophisticated over time. But here you see the freestanding pole holding up the gable and the end of the ridge, and you see the projecting gable ends as horns, symbolic horns. You also see that the ridge is overhanging, even though the roof is no longer sloping outwards. The gable end is not sloping outwards yet any longer, but the sense of an overhanging eaves is implied by the overhanging ridge. The construction technique is very sophisticated. That, I'm sure, happened over time. It got more and more a polished technique of building. However, in some of the temple buildings, these are at the Ise Shrine, which is not too far away from Kyoto, north of Kyoto. Here you see a building which is closer to what we saw in Indonesia, but the overhanging eaves is now only represented by the ridge piece. Notice too that because of the problems of earthquake movement and high winds in Japan, they need to weigh down the roof, the ridge particularly, with these transverse logs to prevent it from disintegrating. The main building of the Ise Shrine is just a larger version of what you've seen. The side buildings I was showing you were mostly rice bins or small halls, but now you have the main hall, an extremely beautifully constructed hall with a transverse entrance, up a grand flight of steps, and huge logs weighing down the ridge, but otherwise all the same features. Here it is square on. And the overhanging eaves. Many of the side buildings don't have elaborate stairs, they simply have notched logs, rather sophisticated form of them, but of course very close to the way in which a gangplank would have been made in early boats. Now that tradition of building survives in the mountains in Japan, in the remote areas. And you get a very interesting form of communal house. It's an extended family house. It not only houses all the members of a family, up to 20 members perhaps, but also all the workers for that family in the fields. And so I'm going to show you one of these houses. They're called gasso houses. G-A-S-S-O in English. And they have many of the same features. They have the great thatched roof and the very heavy ridge piece overhanging at the ends. Often they have projecting members up to represent bull's horns, but you don't see that here. The side buildings are generally later additions. They're lean-to. And we're going into this gasso house. See, a big effort has been made to represent the overhanging ridge. And here is a plan of that building, but the photographs that I took were taken from the right-hand side. And that was the entrance side. So that is the entrance. And you come in on the ground level, and the workmen could take their clothes off, and there's a storeroom for clothes and farm equipment there. And this is a later addition of an ablution unit next to the entrance. And here you came in, and then having taken off your clothes and your boots, cleaned up as much as you could, you were able to climb up onto the raised platform of the house which was here. The raised platform had two sunken trays in it, a raised platform made of bamboo, basically. The two sunken metal trays for fire, one there and one there. This one is basically for the men and particularly for the workmen. And this one is for the family and particularly the women and the children, and is next to the cooking area, which was here and was itself a cooking area, with a later addition of a modern kitchen there. The private room for the owner and his wife to sleep was here, and there was a room which was a room for prayer, and also a sacred room in the house in the northwest corner, and that had a tokonami niche there. This room was a room for girls and women, and it could double as a dark room for childbirth. The rest of the family slept either here, or some of the boys would sleep around here, and the workmen tended to sleep up in the gallery, up in the attic. I'll show you in a moment. So a view of that, and we are looking from the entrance. Here is the fireplace for the workmen. Sorry, I'm not getting this to work. And the fireplace for the family. Notice over the fireplaces there are hanging units. This is not the same building, but it shows more clearly the principle of the metal tray which fitted in there for the fire, and the bamboo raised floor, and the earthen floor next to it for the men to use when they were covered with mud. So the men could actually come right up close and warm their hands at the fire. Here is the attic in which the workmen slept, and obviously some of the family, the boys. And there's an upper attic as well, where presumably lots of things were stored. Notice that the building is not elaborately constructed with tenon and mortise joints. It's all tied together in the way it is in very primitive architecture. So here is that being done. Now, when it came to coping with the climate, we're up in the mountains, but nevertheless it can get very hot in the daytime in summer. And so the whole house can be opened up with sliding screens. But in winter, you need the maximum of insulation, so the house can be closed with only a minimum of light through tiny vertical slits of rice paper. Now that is the ancient architecture in the mountains. When we come down to the plains, particularly the very fertile plains around Kyoto, between Osaka and the north, which is the main agricultural area of the main island of Japan, there you get a more sophisticated version of the same architecture. You still have the expression of the boat roof with the ridge overhanging, but now you get a smaller building. It doesn't have such a big extended family, and sometimes you even get hipped roofs, but still the same expression at the top. The main rooms are raised up slightly. They're no longer on stilts, but they're raised up 3 feet above the ground. This area, I'll try and show it to you. This area is everything above that is on ground level. So that is all for people to use who are covered with mud, and the workmen coming in from the fields, including ovens. Here is the tray for the fire, for cooking, close to the edge so that the men can benefit from it in cold weather. And this is the main open area of the house where the workmen and the family meet, and the family sit up on this raised platform, do the cooking, look after the house. The private rooms are here. the family room for the husband and the wife, the room for the children, and a prayer room here with a Turconomy niche. This is a storeroom. This room doubles as a room for weaving with a balcony which can be used in summer. So here it is, showing again how the house can be opened up, showing how it still relates to the traditional architecture in many ways. And here's a floor plan from the 15th or 16th century, when the architecture is beginning to be much more systematic. And this is a diagram from a building manual, which has been interpreted here to show you how half the house approximately was on the ground, was earth floor, half the house was raised. There was often a double insulation system for the winter, and that also allowed access along there in bad weather. And then the living quarters, the main living quarters are of course in the front, and the private area is at the back, which they call a storeroom in this diagram. Notice the central ridge is carried on a series of strong columns, spaced about 6 feet apart. Going north of Tokyo, you come to the region which is earthquake prone and also very, very cold in winter, and indeed quite cool even in summer. And so you start to get a very insulated building. And here you can see more clearly the expression of the ridge. And it does look quite like the boat culture of Indonesia, doesn't it? It appears to have some link to it. Here's the plan. You go in through a lobby which is on the ground. There's where the raised area starts there. So here is the entrance to it. Again, a view of the outside. The lifted, you saw there, if you could go back 1 minute, you saw the lifted roof to allow the smoke out from the fire. And here is a woman attending the fire on the raised platform, which of course has now layers of mats on it to try and increase the insulation in winter and make it warmer. Now, once Chinese influence had come in, we start to get more sophisticated architecture. And now I'm going to the house of a nobleman in the ancient capital of Japan, Kashihara Jingu, which is east of Kyoto and south of Nara. And this house I stayed in for several weeks, and is a very good example of a sophisticated house of the late Heian period. It is from about 1300, the house originally, obviously repaired continuously. So here it is approached up the main street of the town. There's a drain on both sides, so you see the drain there. You go across the drain on the stone platform, and there's a sliding door made out of waterproof weatherboarding, and you go in through to the entrance. So we've come in from the street. Sorry, there we are. And there's the drain. And we come in through that door, and we enter a courtyard. And the courtyard has the storerooms for grain and produce on 2 sides of it, and the house on a 3rd side, and a glimpse of the farmlands on the 4th side. There is another big farm yard here with animals in it and so on, and the main entrance to the farm through there. There is a 3rd courtyard at the back of the house with some more of the most important storerooms protected by the house. This wall of the house apparently is all closed off, but there are doors here which can be slid back to open to that passageway through the house, which is all on the earth. This is all at ground level again, all of this, including the main cooking area. So we'll go in and see that. So here we are looking along the length of the house. So there is the entrance. These doors slide back, and one goes through into the cooking area, all on the ground, and then goes up steps into the house itself. The house itself is divided into two zones. The right-hand zone is completely private, only for the family. The left-hand zone is two anterooms to the main room of the house, and here visitors are formally received. You've got to understand that as a wealthy nobleman, it was necessary to receive visitors formally, and so this house has that formal area. At the back of the house is an extension. This extension was added in 1610 when the emperor visited the house and stayed there. And so for that purpose, I'll show you, you'll see lots of redecoration was done. But for the emperor, two main rooms, the anteroom and the private room of the emperor, and then a garden designed for the emperor's use, and also for the emperor, a private ablution area. All of it raised up and looking down into the farmland. So here I am sitting up on the roof, and we're looking at the emperor's garden, and these are the emperor's extra rooms, and there's the private bathroom area. And this is the central courtyard of the farm. It contains a well over on the left. It's more open at the entrance, and there's a well, which is the main water supply for the family. Now this house is 1300, so it's a very early and very old house, even though continually repaired. But within 100 or 200 years, the architectural style became more and more sophisticated. So this is typical of the so-called Shibui style of great beauty, which was developed in the 15th century and 16th centuries. So houses could be very similar in plan to the one we're looking at, but have a much more elegant architectural style. Going back to our house again, we are now entering the house through those sliding doors on the ground level, going into the kitchen area, and there is the mother of the house greeting us. This is not the same house because I didn't have a good photograph of this area, but this is almost identical. This is the cooking area and the way it looked and the way the roof is constructed, looking at the steps leading up to the private areas of the house and the formal reception areas. Very typically, the roof beams are as natural as possible, just the bark stripped off them. The rest of the roof construction can be very elegant in planed wood, but not the main beams. And you see the elegance as you look up at the raised roof for letting the smoke out over the fire. So here is a typical fireplace on the earthen floor in which quite elaborate meals can be cooked. And above the fireplace, the raised roof to let out the smoke, and a structure of beams which allows pots to be hung down over the fire. You see again, this one is hanging on ropes, doing the same thing. So the main beams are always as natural as possible, and then the architecture becomes much more sophisticated. And there are 4 styles of roof construction in Japan. Notice that none of them are really triangulated. The bottom left one looks as though it is, but it's because it's so simple. But the others are very close to the Chinese tradition of vertical and horizontal members. And now we're looking at the raised up area as you approach it, going up the steps, and you see the very beautiful roof construction. Now the floor is made out of mats, which are let into a framework. They're called tatami mats, and they're very beautifully woven, giving a very smooth surface, about the same texture as a carpet. and they are made on a grid pattern. I'll say more about that in a moment. The walls are, of course, made of sliding screens, and here we have the contrast between summer and winter. So the house can be completely opened to take account of the very hot summer. Now, I said that the Tahami mats were designed on a modular pattern, but the module, unlike the view of many European writers, the modules do not determine the plan of the house. The module is designed for each room. So you notice here on the right, we have a different module size for the two rooms. So the notice here at the bottom is the one to read. Tatami for any given room are all of the same size, but the size may vary from room to room. Well, this photograph sums it all up in many ways, because you can see the natural shape of the main beams and the way in which the rest of the woodwork is very refined, and the house becomes more refined as you come down to the level of the roof and the floor. Now, one may wonder how they dealt with winter, and of course, one way of dealing with it, and a major way, was the wearing of silk in many layers, so that the human body could be protected from the cold. But it was necessary to keep out the wind and provide some insulation. So the Japanese developed a system of 5 or 6 layers of sliding screens. Well, that would give you good protection in winter, but what about in summer? You'd have too many layers of sliding screens. That was easily dealt with because the tracks were made using half rounds, very small pieces of wood to create the track. This meant that you could actually lift the screen out of the track and remove it and put it in a wooden box. So in summer, many of those screens are packed away in boxes in the roof and only brought out for the winter. You notice this one introduces glass. That's obviously a modern introduction. But normally you would have the paper, rice paper screen on the inside, insect screening in the same way as we would have it, very similar, and then heavy wooden shutters in 2 layers usually, one with some openings in it and the other completely closed. So that shows you the half rounds looking down at them from above, making it very easy to remove the screens. Here is the room I stayed in, the Emperor's room. And my host, you notice even the Emperor slept on the floor. And my host made a joke of the approach to the tokonomi niche, where one would normally be welcomed by a Zen or a Shinto scroll, but I'm welcomed by a bottle of sake. Very sophisticated host. The problem of sleeping on the ground came in winter, of course, when it got very cold. And so that was dealt with by putting, before one went to sleep, putting heated blocks of terracotta into the bed, so that the bed was very warm when you got into it. Here we are looking from the bed out into the bath and the Emperor's garden from the bed. Not in the same house, but a very similar example of the tokonomi niche, the cupboard next to it, and the sliding screens on both sides, and the tatami floor. Now I'm back into the Emperor's house, one of my own photographs, and these are the scrolls that were painted for the Emperor's visit, that my host put up in the house for my edification when I was staying there. And they were all brought out of, they're stretched onto wooden frames, and they're brought out of a wooden chest from the attic. They're priceless, of course. Looking from the Emperor's bed through into the main entertaining room of the house with the doors open gives you this diagonal vista. through the anteroom to the main room, and you see the table around which everybody sits. And here again, looking into the Emperor's garden. Now the anteroom to the Emperor's garden, and I'm sorry, to the Emperor's room, the anteroom, obviously would have been originally very bare and just had a few mats for sitting on. It's very difficult in a Japanese house like this to find a place to put modern equipment like a television set or a piano. So they put them in the anteroom to the Emperor's room. It's a room which has no other use. And here's the main entertaining room of the house. One sits around the table on either on no mats or very little cushions, small cushions, squatting on with your legs crossed. And here is the mother of the house entertaining me during a meal in the traditional way, sitting in the anteroom to the main room with a screen behind her, a painted screen behind her, blocking out the view of the kitchen, of the cooking area, and playing one of the traditional instruments. And here she's playing another instrument. Now we're in the roof, in the attic space, and here's where all the wooden boxes were to store those sliding screens and wall paintings. Again, notice the huge beams, which are natural shape. And this is the farmland seen from the Emperor's bathroom. Being one of the premier nobles of Japan, my friend lost most of the wealth of the farm after the war, expropriated by the Americans. Not far away is one of the Chinese Buddhist temples that was established in the late 5th and early 6th centuries AD. And here is the gateway, I showed it to you before, of such a temple. And of course the main gateway and the main temple behind it and the treasury behind that all transverse to the main central axis. Notice the great simplicity of and elegance of the Chinese architecture. And they introduced tile roofs, and they introduced a completely different style of architecture to Japan, along with, of course, writing and an immense amount of sophistication in life. So Confucianism is introduced into Japan at that time, and Taoism, and an enormous amount of Chinese influence develops very fast in Japan. The main hall. Going up the steps, and here we have a Japanese development, a later version. As it gets more independent of Chinese influence, you start to get quite elaborate shapes. First of all, the octagon, which was a Chinese symbol for success. I'm so sorry, a Japanese symbol for success. Notice too the curved roofs being developed in a very elegant way. And then the Chinese pagoda is built, but as the Japanese developed Chinese styles, they introduced more variations in them. And so this one is unlike a Chinese pagoda in that it has varying projections of roof, alternating projections of roof, and has much more sense of life and lightness than a very regular Chinese pagoda would have had. Still a very early building though. This is something like the 8th century, 9th century. That is from a temple called Yakashiji. Running through the whole height of the pagoda is a single column which culminates in the representation of umbrellas at the top. And there's, standing in front of it is a very tall statue of the Buddha. Very beautiful building, isn't it? So you can see what an impact Chinese culture had on Japan. Different building materials, a great sense of order and control, very elegant use of materials. And of course, where the emperor was living and where the emperor was praying, the use of red as the imperial color with gilded roofs. So this is the ancient Buddhist temple of Nara, which was the capital after Kyoto was first founded, but didn't become the capital. Nara became the capital for several hundred years, and this was a great Buddhist shrine built in about 1000 A.D. And you can see how very Chinese it is in style. Very useful because it gives us an idea what Chinese architecture of that period was probably like, since we have so little of it left, hardly anything. And the Japanese have kept up the traditional coloring techniques. Now, not surprisingly, with the introduction of Confucius and Confucian ideas, Japan became very aware of the idea of order and harmony. And so both Nara and Kyoto were laid out using the Confucian design traditions, with the royal palace at the north, number 1, and the main entrance at the south next to 7 and 8. And a great central avenue, and then a series of blocks. But what's curious is quite quickly the Japanese changed the idea of the blocks. Whereas in Chinese designs, the blocks had been self-contained towns, as it were, clan enclosures. In Japan, that didn't happen. They introduced cross streets from the start. And so the blocks become subdivided into quite smaller much smaller units. And you have the opportunity to build family units instead of clan-sized units in the town. So that is modern Kyoto, and it still has the same plan. Now here is the Great Gateway, a typical city gateway of the Japanese period around 1000 A.D. And here is the entrance into the imperial palace, also central on the axis. You see it's become a little less concerned with fortifications than the Chinese. It's much closer to the Buddhist gateway tradition, but very, very elegantly designed and built. By the way, it's not the original, because the original was destroyed by fire several times. And so this is a reconstruction of the 19th century. And behind it you had the Great Hall, and we in fact don't have the whole of the original imperial city left, but only one part of it. But this gives you a sense of the architecture. Notice the raked gravel in the courtyard and the very formally planted plants. Next. 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 Very elaborate roof construction. Next. And next. Next. And the royal throne, looking out into the courtyard. An architecture of simplicity and extraordinary elegance and grace. Shibui was a very important word for them. the word meaning the ultimate in elegance. And here are temples being built in Kyoto in the succeeding centuries. Can I recommend two Japanese books to you as light reading? One is called The Diary of Shai Shonigan, written in that palace in Kyoto, and written in the 11th century, going on to the 12th, and then at about the same period, The Tale of Genji by Murasaki. They are two of the great books in the history of the world. One is a diary, but it tells you an extraordinary amount about human nature and life in Japan in that period. And the other is a novel, also giving you many ideas of the Japanese nature of virtue and of courage and pride. Very wonderful books. Now, I want therefore to go back into Japanese values and Japanese culture. It's very hard to know what prehistoric religion was like in Japan, obviously. And even taking modern Shinto and trying to use it as a guide, it's not easy to go back in time and be certain how much of modern Shinto is indeed similar to prehistoric beliefs. But we get a sense of two things. First, that like many people around the world, ancestry worship was terribly important to the Japanese. They revered their ancestors. And so a central issue in Shinto is respect for the ancestors, particularly at moments of birth and marriage, and presumably of death. And that continues to the present day. Nearly all Japanese families will go to Shinto shrines to present their child and represent the importance of the birth of a new life. And the same will happen during a wedding and a betrothal. And the other aspect of Shinto that is probably very ancient is the idea that everything has life. Even a stone has life. And that life is the essence of existence. The individual existence, our existence, your existence, is meaningless. It's tiny. It's just a spot of dust in eternity. What matters is the continuity of life in all creation. Everything has a spirit, a kami. And so we respect every aspect of life, every aspect of the universe. And we don't destroy it. So this, in a way, is amazing because it brings ancient Japanese philosophy very close to ancient Chinese Taoism and to what began to be the Chinese way of interpreting Buddhism. That is that you need to be aware all the time of your place in relation to all of creation, to all of the things around you. And to be aware of that, you need to meditate, to think and be alone, to go out into the fields, out into the woods, out into the ocean, and think about creation. So there begins to be quite an affinity between Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism had come in from China and was, of course, given tremendous impetus in Japan. Quite an affinity between Zen Buddhism and Shinto, the ancient Japanese beliefs. And the result is that it became a practice in Japan not for a person not to be dedicated to one religion, but to believe in everything. So you accept Shinto and you accept Buddhism equally. And for the average for the average Japanese family, the important rituals of birth and marriage are Shinto rituals, traditional rituals. And for the average Japanese family, the important rituals for death are those of Buddhism. And so they keep both religions as equally important. Now, not surprisingly, the religions started to influence each other. So now we're looking at a major Shinto shrine at the port of Tokyo, Kamakura, and this 13th century shrine has a lot of the elegance of Chinese Buddhist architecture. And the thing that really demarcates it for most people is that its roofs are entirely of thatch, of heavy thatch. And it has the overhanging ridge at the top. So it is and it doesn't have a central axial sense in the same way as the Chinese one. But look at the roof constructions. So it's a mixture of two architectures, of Buddhist, Chinese, and of Shinto. But it's clearly a Shinto shrine because of the heavy roof. And the other element that is often clearly Shinto is the use of natural materials, which are not painted, but left natural. So here's a Shinto shrine, and next to it, a much smaller bell tower, also Kamakura. When you start to get tiled roofs, you're almost certainly in a Buddhist shrine. But the Buddhist shrines start to get mixed with the Shinto, and some of the Buddhist shrines take on one roof which is thatched and one roof which is tiled. So this one is raised up on stilts. It has a lot in common with the early architecture we saw, and the great thatched roof, and is clearly a Shinto shrine. And here, a combination mixed up with a very elaborate pagoda for a Buddhist shrine, but with some of the elements of Shinto mixed in with it. Very interesting, that, isn't it? Very Japanese. Now here is a small Buddhist temple in Nara, a very ancient one from the 11th century. And what I wanted to point out is the way the site is developed. It's a very elegant temple, but look at the way the site is developed, with rocks taking the place of plants. Paths through a gravel bed, which clearly seems to represent an ocean. But altogether, it's a very strange mixture of two traditions of gardening. One representing nature, and the other symbolic. Buddhist again. But what grows with importance in time is the fact that when one's taking part in any religious ritual, it should involve meditation. And so the Taoist garden becomes more and more important in Japan and more symbolic. So here we have the mountains represented by plants, the water represented by sand. Here, the water represented by gravel, the mountains represented by rocks. With a very strange new addition, which is the importance of the paintings on the walls in the background. Abstract paintings of extraordinary beauty, which take part in that sense of endlessness of eternity being represented. You could hardly get a better representation of eternity, could you, than this courtyard garden. Quite small. Amazing. One of the most beautiful places in Japan. By contrast, a castle. Castles began to be built particularly in the 14th century onwards through to the 17th century, and usually under strict control from the emperor. And that brings us to the culminating point in our discussion, which is trying to understand the great Japanese architecture of the 17th century. And we're going to take as our place to examine it, Katsura, the imperial villa, out in the countryside. It's the imperial villa, but it was owned by a cousin of the emperor, and built to enshrine all that was best in Japanese beliefs. So it seems to be an endlessly meandering building. But there's more logic to it than you realize at first sight. It's in a vast garden which is all developed in Taoist lines and surrounded by half a dozen tea houses for meditation. So here is the main hall. And straight away we have some point of fixation, which is that the roof is the highest roof in the whole complex by far and has a very dominant ridge. But it quickly meanders. It's a stilted construction with a gravel ditch around it. And it appears often to be very asymmetrical. But you can take a small part of it like this, and it's absolutely ordered. So there's a dialogue going on here between order and a lack of order. Order and beginnings to be a strange lack of order. Here you can see the lack of order very clearly. It's strange how it steps up on the left and the window isn't in an obvious place, but in one corner. It's still very carefully composed, but it's the composure of asymmetry. And here is the garden. Of course, it's a traditional Taoist garden, filled with symbolism. And the house is in the background, one wing of the house. The garden seen from one of the main rooms of the house. I want to talk to you about this idea of meandering plan by going back to the house that I stayed in Kashihara Jingu. Now, when they added the emperor's rooms to the house they were adding the rooms to was a perfect rectangle. It may not look it in that plan, but you remember the roof. There's a central ridge, isn't there? And the whole roof was absolutely balanced, so it was a perfectly rectangular roof. But they didn't add the emperor's room in any formal way. Even though he was the emperor, they added the rooms in one corner. Now you could say there was a reason for that in the position of the site, perhaps there was. But the fact that they did it in 1610 suggests that they were willing to accept a lack of symmetry, a lack of order. In fact, they were celebrating it. You remember the diagonal views through. It's not axial any longer. Why are they accepting it? Because if you accept that endlessness is important, that everything is equally important, then you accept the idea that in human society we may need order for control, but that in life, in the universe, things are in every direction. It doesn't matter. So the meandering plan is an expression of that endlessness, of that eternity. Next, if we go back now to the Katsura Villa plan, Now here is an extension of what happened in the Kashihara Jingu house. Here you have the rectangular roof. Oh, I'll use this. And the biggest roof on the site. And then they added to it these rooms that are all higgledy-piggledy in this wing. But on this side, look how they added onto the rectangular roof all of this that meanders across the site like that. Extraordinary, isn't it? So it's an extension of the idea that you saw in 1610, but carried in the latter part of the century to an extraordinary extreme. The building flows across the site in every direction. Now, if you thought of a Taoist approach to architecture instead of a Confucian approach, that is, in Taoism you are trying to be in harmony with nature and accept endlessness. So look at the diagonal views you're going to get through this house. Nothing's axial at all. So there's that sense of the unexpected, the mystery of space going on in different directions that you can't foretell before you get there. It's always an endless experience, and that's what they were trying to do. Now there are pictures of that, and then to end it today, I want to talk about one other aspect of the Katsura villa, and that is that Lord Katsura was the man who developed the tea ceremony in Japan, and indeed wrote a book about it. And in the tea ceremony, he had the idea of creating a situation that was perfect for meditation, so that one could come to terms with one's environment. To us it may seem strange, but the idea was that a small group of people, 2 or 3, would go into a tiny hut in the landscape. This hut would be made out of very rough materials, and you couldn't just open a door and walk in. You usually had to climb in through a window. And then you would squat in this very primitive environment, and someone would formally make a cup of tea for you. It would be a bowl of tea, and it would be extremely hot. And you would be forced to sit for ages while it cooled down before you could sip it. And you'd be sitting in this primitive building looking into the landscape through a rough opening. And you'd be sitting thinking about your relationship to that world. And it would enforce contemplation on you. There was no conversation in a tea ceremony. It was entirely silent. And the whole ceremony would take about half an hour. And it enforced meditation. And so it was developed as a culture thing in Japan. And one would go from one tea hut to another tea hut to experience another part of nature and another part of the world in the same way. It's a very strange experience, a tea ceremony, but very formal thing. It's not something you can treat lightly or play around with. And it's very rough. So I'm going to show you at the beginning of the next lecture a couple of pictures of the tree houses. You can see how they're built. Thank you.